You don't belong here. Escort her out. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced, sharp enough to stop conversations mid-laugh and suspend champagne glasses mid-air across the grand ballroom of the Avalon Grand, where tickets started at $5,000 a seat and influence flowed thicker than the crystal chandeliers above. Imani Hayes didn't move. Not when the words landed. Not when heads turned. Not when a man in a tailored tux glanced at her, then away, as if confirming a quiet assumption he didn't have to say out loud. She stood there in a sleek black dress, no diamonds, no designer logos screaming for attention, just presence. Calm, centered, deliberate. The kind of presence that didn't ask for permission. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now back to Imani Hayes. The security guard hesitated for half a second, just enough to reveal doubt before training took over, and he stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't neutral either. It carried the quiet weight of assumption. Around them, whispers began to ripple. Is she on the list? Who invited her? This is a closed gala. Imani's eyes moved slowly across the room, not searching, not pleading, observing, cataloging. The marble floors, the gold-trimmed stage, the massive digital screens cycling through sponsor logos. Logos she recognized better than anyone in the room. A woman near the bar leaned toward her companion and murmured, just loud enough. They really need to tighten security this year. A soft laugh followed. Imani heard it. She heard all of it. And still, she didn't flinch. Check the list again, she said, her voice low, even, almost quiet enough to disappear beneath the music. But it didn't. It cut through, clean and controlled. The event director, a tall white man with a polished smile that never reached his eyes, stepped in quickly, sensing attention shifting. We already did, he replied, louder now, projecting authority for the growing audience. And you're not. On it. Phones began to lift subtly. Not obvious. Not yet. But enough. A young staffer off to the side frowned, glancing down at a tablet, her fingers hovering like she wasn't sure if she should speak. I think I saw. It's handled. The director snapped, cutting her off before the sentence could breathe. The room tightened. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just charged. Imani tilted her head slightly, as if considering something far bigger than the moment in front of her. Then she reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and unlocked it with a single smooth motion. No rush. No panic. Just precision. You're making a mistake, the director added, softer now, but edged with irritation. Imani finally looked directly at him. And for the first time, something shifted. Not in her. In him. No, she said calmly. You already made it. Her thumb hovered over the screen for just a second. Then she tapped. Call the board, she said into the phone. Now. And just like that, the energy in a $2 million room began to change, not because anyone knew who she was yet, but because something in her tone made it clear. This wasn't a woman trying to get in. This was someone deciding whether this entire night would continue at all. The call did not echo through the room, but it moved through it, subtle and immediate, like a shift in pressure before a storm. Imani Hayes lowered her phone slowly, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if she had just confirmed something routine instead of triggering something far larger than anyone present could see. The event director let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but it lacked confidence. The board, he repeated, glancing briefly at the security guard as if looking for reassurance in someone else's uncertainty. This is a private gala. You do not call anyone here. But even as he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier sharpness. Around them, the energy in the ballroom began to fracture into pockets of curiosity. Conversations did not resume. They shifted. Guests leaned closer to one another, lowering their voices but sharpening their attention. A man near the stage adjusted his cufflinks while watching openly now. A woman in a silver gown tilted her head, studying Imani with a new kind of interest, not dismissal but calculation. Something was not adding up, and people who were used to reading rooms for a living could feel it. The young staffer with the tablet stepped forward again, slower this time, more careful. Her eyes moved from the screen to Imani and back again, her brows knitting together. Sir, she said quietly, almost to herself but loud enough to reach the director. "There is an executive clearance tag tied to. I said it is handled." He cut in again. But this time the interruption came too quickly, too defensive. It did not silence her doubt. It exposed his. Imani watched the exchange without moving, her gaze calm but precise, as if every reaction was confirming something she already knew. She had seen this before. Not in this exact room, not under these exact lights, but in the same pattern, the same tone, the same quiet dismissal wrapped in polished professionalism. At 22, she had stood outside a corporate fundraiser in Chicago, invitation in hand, while a host glanced at her once and said, "This event is for registered guests only." She had shown the invitation twice. It did not matter. The decision had already been made before the conversation started. That memory did not sting anymore. It sharpened. Back in the present, a phone buzzed softly in the director's pocket. He ignored it at first, forcing a smile back onto his face as he turned toward the surrounding guests. "Everything is under control," he announced, projecting calm that no longer felt natural. But the phone buzzed again, and then again. This time, he hesitated, just long enough for people to notice. The security guard shifted his weight, no longer reaching for Imani, no longer certain of his role in a situation that was quietly slipping out of script. Across the room, one of the large screens flickered for a fraction of a second before returning to the sponsor loop. But even that brief disruption drew a few more eyes. Small cracks. Subtle, but spreading. The young staffer looked back down at her tablet, her fingers finally moving, pulling up deeper access layers she was not supposed to. Check without permission. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she looked up at Imani again, this time not with uncertainty, but recognition forming in real time. "Sir," she started again, her voice firmer now. "I really think you need to." The director's phone rang. Not a buzz this time. A full, unmistakable ring that cut through the controlled atmosphere he had been trying to maintain. He stared at the screen. His expression changed. Just a flicker. But enough. Because in a room built on status, power, and perception, that flicker was louder than any announcement. And Imani Hayes, still standing exactly where they told her she did not belong, simply waited as the room began, piece by piece, to realize they had been looking at the wrong person all along. The ringtone did not last long, but it lasted long enough. Every second it rang. The illusion of control in the room thinned. The event director stared at his phone like it had betrayed him, his thumb hovering just above the screen, unsure whether answering it would restore authority or destroy what little he had left. Around him, people were no longer pretending not to watch. Conversations had stopped completely now. Even the soft background music felt distant, like it had stepped back to let something else take center stage. He finally answered, "Yes." His voice came out tighter than he intended. He turned slightly away from the crowd, but not far enough. Not private enough. A pause. Then his posture shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. "I understand," he said, quieter now. Another pause. His eyes flicked toward Imani without meaning to. "No, she is not on the list," he added, trying to reclaim ground that was already slipping. Then came the third pause. Longer this time. Heavy. His shoulders straightened, but not with confidence. With realization. "Yes, I see." The call ended. He did not move right away. He just stood there, phone still in his hand, as if processing something that did not fit into the version of reality he had been operating under just minutes ago. The young staffer stepped closer, no longer hesitant. "Sir," she said, more firmly now, "the executive override is real. It is tied to a primary stakeholder account. I have never seen that level of clearance before." Her words did not carry panic. They carried certainty, and certainty was louder than anything else in the room. A man near the front, someone who had been introduced earlier as a major donor, leaned toward another guest and whispered, "Primary stakeholder?" The phrase traveled fast, faster than any announcement could have. Because in rooms like this, titles mattered. Ownership mattered more. The security guard took a small step back, his stance no longer directive, no longer authoritative. Just present. Waiting. Imani noticed. She noticed everything. The shift in distance. The change in tone. The way the room was beginning to reevaluate her without her having to say another word. But she did not speak yet. Not because she could not. Because she did not need to. Across the ballroom, one of the large screens flickered again, this time longer. The sponsor logos froze for a second, then dissolved into a blank interface before snapping back. A few guests turned fully now, attention splitting between the director and the screens, as if the entire system behind the event was beginning to hesitate along with him. The director finally looked at Imani directly, really looked this time, not at her dress, not at her lack of visible status symbols, but at her composure, at the stillness, at the absence of urgency. And for the first time, doubt fully replaced assumption. "Who are you?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could dress it in authority. It was not a challenge. It was a gap. Imani took a single step forward. Not dramatic, not rushed, just enough to close the space that had been used to keep her out. "That is the wrong question," she said calmly. The room held its breath again, but this time it felt different. Not tense, expectant. Her gaze moved past him briefly, taking in the entire ballroom, the stage, the screens, the carefully curated illusion of exclusivity built on decisions made behind closed doors. Then she looked back at him. "The question you should be asking," she continued, her voice steady, controlled, unmistakably clear, "is why your system flagged me at the highest level, and you still decided I did not belong." No one spoke, because in that moment, the problem was no longer her presence. It was their judgment, and that realization had just begun to settle into every corner of the room. Silence did not fall over the room. It settled, heavy and deliberate, pressing into every conversation that no longer dared to continue. The director opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out at first. The confidence that had carried him moments ago was gone, replaced by something slower, more cautious, something that had to think before it spoke. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," he finally said, his tone softer, recalibrated for an audience that was no longer fully on his side. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded incomplete, because the room had already moved past misunderstanding. The young staffer stepped forward again, no longer waiting for permission. Her tablet was now held firmly in both hands, the screen angled toward the director. "It is not a misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady, her posture aligned with something stronger than hierarchy. "Her access is tied to the top tier. This event would not have been approved without that account." A ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, but undeniable. The phrase top tier did not need explanation. In rooms like this, it translated instantly. Influence, authority, ownership. A man near the stage straightened his posture, suddenly aware that he might have been standing too casually in front of something he did not fully understand. A woman near the bar lowered her glass slightly, her expression shifting from amusement to calculation. People were adjusting, not outwardly, internally, repositioning themselves in real time. The security guard glanced at the director, then at Imani, then back again, his role now undefined. He was no longer enforcing. He was waiting for direction that no longer seemed clear. The director exhaled slowly, running a hand along his jaw as if trying to steady himself. "If that is the case," he said carefully, choosing each word now, "then perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private." It was an attempt to contain what was already too visible, to pull it away from witnesses, to regain control through isolation. Imani did not move. "No," she said, her voice still even, still measured, but now carrying something unmistakable. "Finality. You address me publicly. You will correct it publicly." The words did not rise in volume, but they expanded in weight. Around them, a few phones lifted higher now, no longer subtle, no longer hidden. The moment had crossed a line from curiosity into significance. The young staffer looked between them, then spoke again, this time not just to the director, but to the space itself. "Her name is on the master authorization file," she said. "Primary signature level." That phrase landed harder than anything before it, because it did not just imply involvement. It implied control. The director's eyes widened just slightly, enough for those closest to see. "That cannot be right," he muttered, but the doubt in his voice betrayed him. Across the ballroom, the large screens flickered once more, then stabilized, but something about their glow felt different now, as if the system behind them was no longer operating under the same assumptions. Imani took another small step forward, closing the gap completely now. She was no longer at the edge of the room. She was at its center. "You built this entire evening around exclusivity," she said calmly. "Around who belongs and who does not. Her gaze held his, unwavering. And you made that decision in under 10 seconds. No one interrupted. No one defended. Because everyone in the room had seen it happen. The judgment, the dismissal, the certainty. And now, the reversal was no longer a possibility. It was unfolding. The director swallowed, his composure slipping further, replaced by the realization that whatever authority he thought he held in this room was borrowed. And it was being taken back. The word borrowed did not need to be spoken out loud for everyone to feel it. It lingered in the air anyway, threading through the silence like a quiet truth no one could ignore. The director shifted his stance, his shoulders no longer squared but slightly angled, as if trying to find footing on ground that had already moved beneath him. If there has been an oversight, he began again, attempting to recover structure in a moment that no longer followed his control, then we can resolve this quickly and move forward with the evening. But the room did not accept that offer. Not anymore. Because this was no longer about moving forward. It was about what had already happened. The young staffer lowered her tablet slightly, her voice no longer tentative, now grounded in clarity. It was not an oversight, she said. Her clearance did not fail. It was overridden. That word landed differently. Overridden. Not missed. Not skipped. Actively dismissed. A quiet murmur spread across the nearest cluster of guests, subtle but sharp. A man in a navy tuxedo frowned, turning fully toward the director now. You overrode a primary authorization, he asked, his tone not loud, but carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what that meant. The director did not answer immediately, because there was no version of that answer that sounded right anymore. Imani watched the shift unfold with the same steady composure she had carried from the moment she stepped into the room. Her gaze moved briefly across the crowd, not searching for validation, but observing alignment. Who stepped back? Who leaned in? Who suddenly chose silence? These were the details that mattered. These were the moments that revealed more than introductions ever could. Near the edge of the ballroom, one of the event coordinators hurried toward a side console, whispering urgently into a headset. Across the room, another screen flickered, this time longer, the sponsor rotation freezing completely before resetting again. Systems responding. Quietly. Precisely. The director noticed it too. Of course he did. His eyes darted upward for a fraction of a second before returning to Imani, but the damage was already done. Because now the room was not just watching him. It was watching everything. You are escalating this unnecessarily, he said, the edge returning to his voice, but thinner now, less convincing. This can be handled without disrupting the event. Imani tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. It already has been disrupted, she replied calmly. You just did not notice when it happened. The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any raised voice could have, because it reframed the moment completely. The disruption was not her presence. It was his decision. A woman near the center of the room spoke up quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough to carry. She is right. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was recognition. And recognition, once spoken, spread quickly. The security guard took another step back, fully disengaged now, his role dissolved into observation. The young staffer stood straighter, no longer caught between instruction and instinct, now aligned with something clearer. The director looked around, just briefly, just enough to see it. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible, tangible. The room was no longer with him. Imani reached for her phone again, glancing down at the screen for a moment, then back up. You had a chance to correct this, she said evenly. Quietly. Professionally. Her gaze held his, steady and unyielding. You chose not to. A pause followed. Not empty. Heavy. Intentional. Then she added, her voice just as calm, but carrying a finality that settled over every inch of the ballroom. So now it will be corrected, publicly. And somewhere behind the scenes, unseen but already in motion, the systems that built this night were beginning to listen to her instead. Nothing in the room moved loudly, but everything was shifting. The kind of shift that did not need noise to be felt. One of the large screens at the far end of the ballroom dimmed slightly, then flickered, not enough to cause panic, but enough to break the illusion of seamless control the event had carefully built. A few guests turned fully now, their attention no longer split, no longer casual. Focus had settled. The director followed their gaze instinctively, just for a second, then looked back at Imani, but the delay was enough. He knew it, and so did everyone else. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" he asked, his voice no longer smooth, no longer curated, but edged with something closer to urgency. Imani did not answer. Immediately, she glanced down at her phone once more, reading something that had just come through, then slipped it back into her hand with quiet certainty. "I am allowing the system to respond," she said. Her tone remained calm, but there was something else now beneath it. Not emotion, authority, the kind that did not need volume to be understood. Near the control station, two event technicians exchanged a quick look, one of them tapping rapidly on a console, pulling up back-end access panels that were not part of the public display. Their movements were subtle, but not invisible. "Not anymore. Sir," one of them called out, trying to keep his voice low but failing. "We are getting override signals from corporate access." The word corporate landed like a weight in the center of the room. Because corporate did not mean suggestion. It meant control. The director turned sharply toward the technician, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the strain underneath. "Disable it," he said quickly. "It is probably a system error." But even as he said it, he knew it was not. The technician hesitated, fingers hovering above the keyboard. "It is not an error," he replied carefully. "It is authorized at the highest level." The phrase echoed the earlier one. Primary, top tier, highest level. The pattern was no longer forming. It was complete. A man near the front stepped back slightly, creating space without realizing it, as if proximity itself now carried a different kind of weight. A woman who had been smiling moments ago lowered her expression entirely, watching Imani with a quiet intensity that replaced every earlier assumption. This was no longer a question of belonging. It was a question of ownership. Imani lifted her gaze slowly, taking in the room as it recalibrated around her. Every glance, every shift in posture, every silence spoke louder than any introduction ever could. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. And yet, everything was moving. The director exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his controls slipping in visible increments. "You are disrupting a major event," he said, trying one last time to frame the moment in terms that gave him leverage. "Do you understand what this costs?" Imani met his eyes without hesitation. "Yes," she said. A single word. "Measured. Certain." Then she added, just as calmly, "That is exactly why I get to decide whether it continues." The sentence did not need emphasis. It carried its own. Around them, the technicians continued working, no longer asking for permission, responding instead to instructions that had already outranked the room. Another screen dimmed, then reset. The lighting softened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for those paying attention to notice the pattern. This was not chaos. This was control being reassigned. The director looked around one more time, searching for support, for agreement, for anything that still placed him at the center of authority. But the room had already answered. It had shifted, and standing in the middle of it all, without raising her voice, without stepping back, Imani Hayes had become the point everything else was now moving around. The room no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a turning point. Conversations had not just stopped, they had dissolved, replaced by a quiet awareness that something irreversible was unfolding in real time. One of the main chandeliers dimmed slightly, not enough to darken the room, but enough to shift its tone, like the atmosphere itself was recalibrating. The large digital screen behind the stage flickered again, then froze completely, the sponsor logos disappearing into a blank black surface that reflected the crowd back at itself. A reflection, honest, unfiltered. The technician at the control panel straightened, his voice cutting through the silence without trying to. "We just lost full display control," he said. "No panic, just fact." The director turned sharply, his face tightening as he stepped toward the control station. "Get it back," he demanded, but the command no longer carried the same weight. It sounded delayed. "Outpaced." "We cannot," the technician replied, shaking his head slightly. "The system has been reassigned." Reassigned. That word landed harder than anything else so far, because it confirmed what the room was already beginning to understand. Authority had not disappeared. It had moved. A low murmur spread, no longer hidden, no longer cautious. Guests were no longer whispering to avoid attention. They were reacting to it. A man near the center stepped back entirely, creating distance like proximity itself now required permission. A woman beside him crossed her arms, her expression no longer skeptical but focused, as if recalculating everything she thought she knew about the moment. Imani stood exactly where she had been, but the space around her had changed. It was no longer resistance. It was recognition in progress. She did not move toward the stage. She did not need to. The room was already orienting itself around her. The director turned back to her, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. "You are going too far," he said. Not an accusation, a realization. Imani met his gaze evenly. "No," she replied. "I am going exactly as far as this moment requires." Her words were not sharp. They were precise. And precision carried further than force ever could. Across the ballroom, a soft chime echoed through the sound system, unplanned, unscheduled. Heads turned instantly. Then the overhead speakers clicked, and for a brief second, nothing played. Just silence. Then a calm, automated voice filled the room. System override confirmed. Executive authority in effect. The message was not loud, but it did not need to be. It was final. The kind of final that removed all doubt. The director froze, his posture caught between reaction and disbelief. The young staffer looked at Imani fully now, no hesitation left, only understanding. "It is her," she said quietly, not to the director, but to the truth itself. Phones were no longer subtle. They were raised openly now, capturing everything, not out of spectacle, but because everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would not be repeated the same way twice. The director glanced around one last time, searching for anything that still placed him in control, but every glance returned the same answer. The room had moved on without him. Imani took a slow breath, then spoke, her voice steady, carrying across the entire ballroom without effort. "You built this night to decide who belongs," she said. A pause. Then, just as calmly, "Now it is my turn." And in that moment, the power that had once been invisible became undeniable, not because she revealed it loudly, but because everything else had already bowed to it. The words did not fade when she finished speaking. They stayed, suspended in the air, settling into the room like something permanent. No one rushed to respond. No one tried to interrupt, because the moment had already passed the point where interruption could change anything. The system had spoken, and the system did not hesitate. Imani stood still, her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm, but something behind her eyes had shifted. Not outwardly, internally. A quiet stillness that came from somewhere deeper than the room itself. For a brief second, the ballroom around her seemed to blur, not physically, but in the way memory overlays reality when something familiar resurfaces. She was 19 again, standing at the edge of a scholarship dinner in Atlanta, wearing a navy dress she had saved months to afford, holding an invitation she had checked 3 times before walking in. The woman at the front table had glanced at her, then at the card, then back at her, and said, "I think you might be in the wrong place." No accusation, no raised voice, just certainty. That same tone, that same quiet decision made in seconds. Imani had stood there back then too, not arguing, not explaining, just absorbing the moment as it settled into something she would carry forward. She did not leave that night because she believed them. She left because she understood something they did not. That access was not given. It was built. The memory faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the present, sharper now, clearer. The same room, the same energy, different outcome. Back in the ballroom, the silence had transformed. It was no longer tension. It was awareness. The kind that forces people to reconsider not just what they see, but how they saw it in the first place. A man near the stage lowered his gaze briefly, as if replaying the moment he had chosen not to speak earlier. A woman beside him exhaled slowly, her posture softening, not from comfort, but from recognition. The young staffer stood still, her tablet now lowered completely, her role no longer defined by instruction, but by what she had witnessed. The director remained where he was, but the distance between him and the center of the room had grown, not physically, but in every way that mattered. Imani took a slow breath, grounding herself not in reaction, but in control. The kind of control that did not need to be proven, only exercised. She reached for her phone again, not urgently, not dramatically, just with purpose. Her thumb moved once across the screen. A confirmation. Somewhere beyond the walls of the ballroom, systems were aligning, decisions cascading through channels that did not require approval from anyone in the room. The foundation of the event, the structure that held it together, was no longer neutral. It had chosen its direction. The overhead lights adjusted slightly again, softer now, less theatrical, more real. The illusion of perfection had been replaced by something more honest. Imani lifted her gaze once more, taking in the faces around her, not as an audience, but as witnesses to something they would not easily forget. She did not smile. She did not need to. "This is not new," she said quietly, her voice steady, carrying without force. "It just usually goes unchecked." The words did not accuse. They revealed. And in that revelation, the room understood something it had been built to ignore. This was not about a single moment. It never was. It was about every moment that came before it, and every moment that would come after. The difference now was simple. This time, it would not pass quietly. This time, it would not be ignored. Because the woman they had tried to remove from the room had already become the reason the room could not continue the same way again. The room did not return to normal because there was no normal left to return to. What once felt like a carefully orchestrated evening now felt exposed, like a stage where the script had been taken away mid-performance. The silence that followed her words was no longer heavy. It was awake. People were not just watching anymore. They were thinking, reevaluating, reconstructing everything they had just witnessed in a new light. Imani lowered her phone slowly, her movements measured, unhurried, as if time itself had adjusted to her pace. Somewhere behind the walls, decisions had already been made, chains of authority activated, confirmations logged, actions queued. She did not need to announce it. The room was beginning to feel it. The director took a step forward, then stopped himself, caught between instinct and consequence. "Listen," he said, his voice quieter now, no longer projecting, no longer performing. "We can correct this. We can make an announcement, clarify your status, restore the event." His words were careful, almost pleading, but beneath them was something else. Fear of loss. Not just of position, but of control. Imani looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. "You are still trying to fix perception," she said calmly. "I am addressing reality." The distinction landed clean. Around them, a few guests exchanged glances, the kind that said more than words ever could. A man near the back shook his head slightly, as if recognizing a pattern he had seen before but never questioned. A woman beside him folded her arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully, her eyes fixed on Imani as if seeing her for the first time. The young staffer stepped closer again, her voice steady, no longer uncertain. "Sir, incoming directive," she said, holding up her tablet. "Executive channel. Priority level." The director hesitated before looking, as if delaying it might change what it said. It did not. His eyes scanned the screen, then stopped. His posture shifted again, this time more visibly. Not a collapse, a realization settling in. "They are suspending program flow," he said under his breath, almost to himself. The technician at the console confirmed it seconds later. "Stage sequence has been halted. All scheduled segments are paused." The ripple this time was louder. Not chaos, not panic, but recognition spreading through a room that understood what that meant. This was not a delay. This was intervention. The director looked back at Imani, searching for something to hold on to, some piece of authority that had not already slipped away. "You are shutting this down," he said, his voice no longer questioning, but acknowledging. Imani did not respond immediately. She let the room sit in that understanding, let it expand, let it reach every corner. Then she spoke, her tone steady, unwavering. "No," she said. A pause. Then, just as clearly, "I am deciding whether it deserves to continue." The difference was everything. Because shutting something down was reaction, deciding its future was power. The overhead lights dimmed slightly once more, not dramatically, but enough to signal transition. The music system clicked, then went silent completely. No background noise, no distractions, just the room, just the truth of it. The director lowered his hand slowly, the one that had been trying to hold on to control, and for the first time, he did not reach for it again. Because he understood now. This was no longer his event to manage. It was hers to judge, and standing in the center of it all, without raising her voice, without stepping out of place, Imani Hayes had turned a room built on exclusion into a moment that could no longer ignore what it had revealed. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt decided. The kind of silence that comes after something irreversible has already been set in motion. No music filled the space. No announcements tried to smooth over what had happened. The room stood still, not because it had to, but because it no longer knew how to continue without acknowledging what stood at its center. Imani Hayes did not rush to fill that silence. She let it settle, let it stretch just long enough for every person in that ballroom to sit with it, to feel it, to recognize their place inside it. Then she took one step forward, not toward the stage, not toward the director, just forward, enough to make it clear she was no longer responding to the room. The room was responding to her. "You built this night on image," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the space without force. "On who looks like they belong. On who fits the expectation." She paused, her gaze moving slowly across the crowd, meeting faces that now held no judgment, only attention. And in less than 30 seconds, you showed exactly how fragile that system is. No one interrupted, because no one could deny it. The director lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in recognition of a truth he could no longer argue against. The young staffer stood completely still, her tablet now resting at her side, no longer a tool of verification, but a witness to what had already been proven. Across the room, guests who had once held quiet authority now stood in quiet reflection, their earlier confidence replaced by something more careful, more aware. Imani reached for her phone one more time, her movements precise, controlled. A single tap, then she lowered it again. No announcement followed, no explanation. But within seconds, the room responded. The overhead lighting softened further, transitioning away from the sharp brilliance designed for spectacle into something calmer, more neutral. The screens behind the stage went dark completely this time. No flicker, no reset, just a clean, deliberate shutdown. The technician at the console exhaled quietly. "All systems suspended," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for those closest to hear. And from there, the understanding spread. Not as confusion, as confirmation. The director looked up again, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. "You are ending it," he said. Not a question, a realization fully formed. Imani met his eyes without hesitation. "No," she said calmly. A pause followed, deliberate, measured. Then she finished, her voice unwavering. "I am holding it accountable." The distinction landed deeper than anything else she had said. Because ending something was final. Holding it accountable meant it had to answer for what it had been. Around them, the room shifted one last time. Not physically, internally. People were no longer deciding what side they were on. They already knew. The event that had been designed to elevate status had instead revealed it. And now, it stood still, waiting for judgment from the one person they had tried to remove. Imani took a slow breath, then spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that settled over every inch of the ballroom. "This event does not continue tonight," she said. No raised tone, no dramatic pause, just clarity, final and precise. And in that moment, without spectacle, without force, the most powerful thing in the room was not the gala, not the guests, not the structure built around them. It was the quiet authority of a woman who had just decided that respect was no longer optional. No one clapped. No one protested. The announcement did not trigger chaos. It triggered something far more unsettling. Acceptance. The kind that spreads quietly, person to person, without needing to be spoken out loud. The gala was over, and everyone in the room knew it before anyone dared to move. For a moment, people simply stood there, holding glasses they no longer intended to drink from, wearing expressions that had not yet decided what to become. Then the smallest shifts began. A man near the back adjusted his jacket, not out of habit, but out of discomfort. A woman beside him set her glass down carefully on a passing tray, her eyes still fixed on Imani, as if she was trying to understand how quickly power had changed hands without a single raised voice. The young staffer was the first to move with purpose. She turned toward the control station, her posture aligned, her voice clear. "Begin shutdown protocol," she said, not asking, not hesitating. The technician nodded immediately, no longer looking toward the director for confirmation. "Copy that," he replied, fingers already moving across the console. Across the ballroom, the effects followed in quiet sequence. Lighting systems dimmed gradually, not plunging the room into darkness, but guiding it out of performance mode. The stage lights faded first, then the ambient glow softened, leaving behind something more neutral, more honest. The screens remained black, no attempt made to revive them. There would be no recovery tonight. The director stood still through all of it, watching as the authority he once held dissolved not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. He opened his mouth once, as if to say something, but closed it again just as quickly. There was nothing left to say that had not already been answered. Around him, guests began to move, not in a rush, but with quiet understanding. Conversations resumed, but different now. Lower. Thoughtful. Some spoke in short sentences. Others simply nodded to one another as they made their way toward the exits. No one argued the decision. No one challenged it. Because deep down, they knew this was not about a canceled event. It was about a corrected moment. Imani remained where she was, not watching people leave, not tracking reactions, just standing with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. She did not need to oversee the exit. The room had already aligned itself. The young staffer returned briefly, stopping a few feet away from her, her voice respectful, steady. "Everything is being shut down," she said. Imani nodded once. "Thank you." 2 words. Simple, but they landed with weight. Because respect, once withheld, now moved differently in the room. Across the ballroom, the last of the service staff began clearing trays, their movements quiet, efficient, no longer part of a show, just part of an ending. The technician powered down the final console, the soft hum of equipment fading into silence. And then, for the first time since the night began, the room was exactly what it had never been designed to be. Still, honest, without illusion. The director took a slow step back, then another, not retreating in defeat, but stepping out of a position he no longer occupied. No one stopped him. No one followed. Because the center of the room had already shifted, and it was no longer his. Imani finally turned, not toward the stage, not toward the exits, but simply toward the open space ahead of her. The event was over, but what it revealed would remain long after the lights came back on somewhere else. Because tonight was never just about a gala. It was about what happens when someone who is told they do not belong decides, calmly and completely, that they do. The ballroom was nearly empty now, but the silence that remained did not feel abandoned. It felt resolved. The kind of stillness that comes after something has been corrected, not erased. Staff moved quietly through the space, clearing tables, folding linens, powering down what had once been designed to impress. Without the lights, without the music, without the performance, the room looked different. Smaller, more honest. Imani Hayes walked slowly across the marble floor, her heels echoing softly now that there was nothing left to drown them out. She did not rush toward the exit. She did not look back to measure what had been done. She simply moved forward, steady and composed, as if this ending had already been decided long before she stepped into the room. Near the entrance, a few guests lingered, not out of curiosity, but reflection. One of them, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, straightened slightly as she approached. "Ms. Hayes," he said carefully, his tone respectful, stripped of assumption. "I did not realize." Imani paused for just a moment, meeting his eyes. "That is the point," she replied calmly. Not harsh, not forgiving, just clear. He nodded once, understanding settling in without defense. Nearby, a woman who had earlier stood silent during the confrontation spoke softly to her companion. "We all saw it," she said. "We just did not say anything." The admission did not seek comfort. It acknowledged responsibility. And that acknowledgement carried further than any apology spoken too late. The young staffer approached again, stopping at a respectful distance. "Transportation is ready if you need it," she said. Imani gave a small nod. "I appreciate it." Her voice remained even, but there was something warmer in it now. Not because the situation had softened, but because clarity had replaced tension. Behind them, the final lights dimmed another degree, leaving the ballroom in a soft, neutral glow. No longer a stage, just a room. The director was nowhere near the center anymore. He stood off to the side, speaking quietly with someone on his phone, his posture no longer commanding, no longer central. The room had moved on from him completely. Imani reached the entrance and paused briefly, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal of the door handle. For a moment, she looked back, Not at the people, not at the staff, but at the space itself. The place that had tried to define who belonged. Now redefined by the one person it tried to remove. It was never about access, she said quietly, more to the room than to anyone in it. It was about assumption. No one responded. They did not need to, because every person still standing there understood exactly what she meant. She opened the door and stepped out into the night air, the city lights stretching beyond the entrance, bright, steady, unaffected by what had just unfolded inside. But the people inside were not the same. The staff would remember. The guests would remember. And the next time a moment like this began to form, it would not pass as easily. Because tonight had changed something simple, but permanent. It had made silence visible. And once seen, it could not be ignored again. Outside, the night air felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just clearer. The kind of clarity that comes when something unresolved has finally been addressed. The city moved as it always did, cars passing, distant lights blinking, conversations continuing on sidewalks that had no idea what had just taken place inside those walls. But for Imani Hayes, the moment was not about the building behind her. It was about what had been said in motion beyond it. She stepped forward onto the pavement, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, carrying the same quiet authority that had shifted an entire room without force. Behind her, through the glass doors, the last remnants of the gala dissolved into routine. Staff resetting, lights dimming further, voices lowering into something more reflective than celebratory. What had been designed as a showcase of status had ended as something else entirely. A correction, a mirror, a lesson no one in that room would easily forget. A black car waited at the curb, engine running, door already open. The driver stepped aside respectfully, but Imani paused before entering. Not out of hesitation, out of intention. She looked once more at the building, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with understanding. Because this was never about one room, one director, or one night. It was about a pattern, a system of quiet decisions made quickly, confidently, and often without consequence. Until now. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up her face for a brief moment. Messages had already begun to arrive. Board confirmations, legal acknowledgments, internal reports triggered automatically by what had just occurred. She scanned them quickly, not with surprise, but with expectation. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should. She typed a short response, precise and direct. Initiate full review. No exceptions. Then she locked the phone and slipped it away. No announcement. No performance. Just action. Across the street, a couple paused mid-conversation, glancing briefly toward the entrance, sensing that something had happened even if they did not know what. That was how moments like this worked. They extended beyond their origin, carried through conversation, through memory, through quiet retellings that grew sharper each time. Imani stepped into the car, then stopped, one hand still resting lightly on the door. Her gaze lifted slightly, not toward the building this time, but forward, toward the city stretching ahead. They thought it was about access, she said quietly, her voice calm, steady. It never was. She paused, just long enough for the weight of that truth to settle. Then she finished, just as evenly. It was about respect. The door closed softly. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the steady flow of traffic, indistinguishable from the outside, but carrying something far more significant within it. Behind her, the building stood unchanged, its lights dim, its doors still open, ready for the next event, the next gathering, the next moment where assumptions might rise again. But something inside it had shifted, not in structure, in awareness. Because the next time someone walked through those doors without fitting the expected image, there would be hesitation. A second thought, a pause where there had not been one before. And that pause would exist because of tonight. Because one woman chose not to argue, not to explain, not to conform, but to stand still and let truth move everything else around her. And that kind of power did not need an audience. It became the proof.